I remember the exact moment I stopped holding my breath. It wasn't when I found the texts on Patrick's phone. The ones he'd been careful about, but not careful enough. Because after 31 years of marriage, I knew where he kept his passwords, and I knew what guilt looked like on his face, before he even turned around. It wasn't when my own daughter, Renee, the girl I had driven to swim practice every Saturday morning at 5:30 for 11 years, sat across from me at our kitchen table, and told me I was being dramatic. It wasn't even when she showed up at my lawyer's office in downtown Ottawa on the morning of our mediation, sat beside Patrick with her hand on his arm, and looked at me like I was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. It was the moment right after that, when my lawyer, a compact, unhurried woman named Beverly Chow, who had spent 22 years in family law and had, in my experience, the emotional range of a well-calibrated harp carpenter's level, set down her pen, looked at the ceiling for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked back at Patrick's lawyer, with an expression I had never seen her wear before. Not anger, not surprise, something closer to relief. The particular relief of a person who has been waiting a long time for the other side to make a specific mistake, and has just watched them make it. And I watched Patrick's face in the moment that followed. I watched him try to read Beverly's expression and fail. I watched Renee's hand tighten slightly on his arm, and I understood that the story they had both written in their heads, the one where I walked out of that office, with what they'd decided I deserved, was about to require some significant revision. My name is Kathleen Morrow. I am 54 years old. I live in the Glebe neighborhood in Ottawa, in a house I have now legally owned outright for 2 years. And what I'm about to tell you is the story of how two people walked into a mediation room, absolutely certain they had already won, and discovered, one document at a time, that the game they thought they were playing had been over before it started. Let me tell you about the version of my life that looked, from the outside, like a comfortable and uncomplicated success. Patrick and I had met in our early 20s at a conference in Montreal. He was in commercial real estate development, just starting out, and I was working in municipal planning for the city of Ottawa. We got married in 1993. We had Renee in 1996 and our son Christopher in 1999. We bought the house in the Glebe when the neighborhood was still considered a gamble by the people who knew better. Patrick always said I had no instinct for risk. He said it affectionately. For the first decade or so. Then he said it less affectionately. Then he stopped saying it directly, and started implying it in the way people do when they've decided you're not worth the full sentence. What Patrick built over those years was real. I want to be clear about that. Morrow Developments grew from a 2-person operation, working out of a converted office on Bank Street, into a mid-sized firm with active projects across eastern Ontario and one significant mixed-use development in Gatineau. He was good at the acquisition side, good at reading land, good at the early vision of what a place could become. He had a talent for convincing investors that the risk was worth it, which is its own particular skill, and not a small one. What I did was the part that doesn't photograph well. I had left my position with the city when Renee was born, with the intention of returning in 2 years. That didn't happen, because 2 years in, Patrick's business was growing faster than either of us had expected, and someone needed to build the infrastructure behind the vision. So I did. I learned construction contract law from a textbook. I ordered from a bookstore on Sparks Street, because we couldn't afford a specialist yet. I managed the trades on our first 3 projects. When the general contractor walked off a job in Canada, and Patrick was in Vancouver trying to hold together a financing arrangement. I built the filing systems, the vendor relationships, the compliance tracking. When we brought on our first project manager, I trained her. When we brought on a controller 2 years after that, I had been doing most of what she did for the previous 5 years. I did all of this without a salary, without a title, without my name on a single piece of external documentation, because Patrick felt it was cleaner to keep the family separation clear for liability reasons. At the time, I understood the logic. I didn't question it. We were building something together. And I trusted that the way you trust the floor under your feet, you don't think about it. It holds, so you walk on it. The thing about Renee is that she had always been closer to Patrick. That was never a secret, and I had never needed it to be otherwise. Some children are wired toward one parent, And Renee was wired toward Patrick's energy, his confidence, his way of filling a room. Christopher was quieter, more cautious, more like me, and we had always understood each other without working at it. I loved both of my children without reservation. I did not believe that Renee would ever weaponize that closeness against me. That was a failure of imagination on my part. I found out about the affair in February. Not through the texts, though the texts came later. I found out because I ran into a woman from our neighborhood at the Rideau Center. A woman I have known for 15 years, and she hugged me for a half-second too long, and then pulled back and looked at me, with an expression so full of pity and calculation that I understood, in the way you sometimes understand things before you have the facts to support them, that something had already happened that I hadn't been told about yet. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for a long time. Then I went inside and I did something I had not done in years. I looked at Patrick's email, not because I thought he was careless. Because I thought that whatever this was, I needed to know the shape of it before I did anything else. I needed to see the architecture before I could figure out what I was dealing with. Her name was Simone. She worked at the Gatineau development. They had been together, based on what I read, for somewhere between 14 and 18 months. The emails were not dramatic. They were worse than dramatic. They were comfortable. They had the tone of two people who had moved past excitement into something more settled and more serious. The particular register of a relationship that has started believing in its own future. I closed the laptop and I sat very still for a long time. Then I called Beverly Chow. I had retained Beverly 3 years earlier. Not because I suspected anything at that point, but because a colleague of mine from my city planning days had told me, over lunch one afternoon, that any woman who had spent more than a decade doing substantial unpaid work inside family business needed independent legal representation, documented and in place, before she ever needed it. She said it plainly, the way people say things they've learned the hard way and want to spare you. I had taken her advice, filed it quietly, paid Beverly's retainer, and thought of it as the kind of insurance you hope you never use. That phone call, made from my kitchen on a cold Tuesday in February, while Patrick was at a site meeting in Nepean, was the most important call I made in the last decade. What followed was 4 months of very careful, very quiet work. Patrick and Renee, who had apparently known about Simone for some time before I did, and had made a decision I still find difficult to think about directly, moved through those months with the ease of people who have already reached a conclusion. Patrick retained a lawyer, a man named Jeffrey, who specialized in high-asset family law, and had an office on O'Connor Street with the kind of furniture that tells you something about how he sets his fees. Renee, for reasons I have turned over many times and have come to understand without entirely forgiving, aligned herself with her father in a way that was clear and consistent, and did not leave much room for interpretation. I watched. I did what Beverly told me to do, and I waited. The mediation was held on a Thursday morning in late June, in a boardroom on the 12th floor of a building on Elgin Street. The weather was the kind Ottawa gets in late June when the summer has finally committed. Warm and clear, with the kind of light that makes the city look like it knows what it's doing. From the window on the south side of the room, you could see the edge of Confederation Park. Renee arrived before I did. I was told afterward she had been there for nearly half an hour. She was dressed carefully, in a dark blazer and tailored trousers, her hair pinned back in a way that looked practiced. She had positioned herself beside Patrick at the far end of the table, which she had no legal standing to do. She was not a party to the mediation. She was not there in any official capacity. She was there because this was her statement. Her way of being present for the conclusion of something she had decided was already finished. Patrick's lawyer Jeffrey had prepared a settlement proposal that was, I will give it this, structurally coherent. It reflected the marital assets on paper, the matrimonial home, the joint accounts, the RRSP holdings. A way that was technically defensible and financially minimizing. It was designed for a woman who believed her contribution to the last 31 years was limited to what she could document with a paycheck. It was designed to be accepted by someone who didn't fully understand what she was owed. Beverly let Jeffrey present every part of it. She did not interrupt once. Then Renee reached into her bag. I don't know what she thought she was doing. I have thought about it many times since. Maybe she needed the room to know which side she was on. Maybe she had rehearsed it, the way she used to rehearse things as a teenager, standing in front of the bathroom mirror before difficult conversations. Maybe she simply couldn't let the moment end without putting her own mark on it. She took out an envelope, letter-sized, cream-colored, sealed. She slid it across the table until it was directly in front of me. Then she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in her entire life. "There's $500 in there," she said. Her voice was flat and even. "For the security deposit on an apartment, somewhere modest. Dad's name is on the house, so?" She shrugged, a small practiced shrug. "You should start looking." The room did not make a sound. Jeffrey Strand actually closed his eyes for approximately 1 second. The involuntary, controlled reaction of a professional who has just watched his client's case be handed a complication. He did not request and cannot unring. Patrick looked at Renee with an expression that was not gratitude. It was the look of a man who had not approved this particular move, and was now quietly calculating what it was going to cost him. And Beverly Chow put down her pen. She didn't pick it up for a moment. She looked at the envelope on the table. She looked at Renee, and then she did something I had never seen her do in the 2 years I had known her. She smiled. Not warmly. Not with any warmth at all, actually. The precise, controlled smile of someone who has just been handed exactly what they needed. "I'd like that statement to be noted for the record," Beverly said in her quietest voice, which was somehow also her most carrying one. Specifically the representation about whose name is on the matrimonial home. She reached into the folder in front of her, dark blue, neatly tabbed, and withdrew the first document. "Because that's actually what I'd like to address first." She placed it in the center of the table and rotated it so the heading faced Jeffrey's side of the room. "The matrimonial home," Beverly said, "is not in fact registered solely in Patrick Morrow's name. It hasn't been for 11 years. The silence that came after that sentence was a different material than the silence before it." Jeffrey leaned forward. His hand was already moving toward the document. "That would be a significant. You're holding it," Beverly said. In 2013, during a period when Morrow Developments had taken on 2 simultaneous projects, and the associated liability exposure had created some concern among the firm's lenders, the matrimonial home had been restructured, placed into a joint tenancy arrangement that was then further modified, on the quiet advice of the firm's corporate lawyer at the time, into a co-ownership structure under Ontario family property law. The documentation was precise and properly registered. It had been sitting in the records of the Ontario Land Registry for 11 years, untouched, uncontested and, based on everything Jeffrey had filed, apparently unread. Patrick had known. He had signed the documents, but that was 11 years ago, and people forget what they've signed when they've signed enough things, and when they've spent 11 years telling themselves a story about whose house it is. "My client's interest in the matrimonial home is legally documented and co-equal," Beverly said. "The structure that's been proposed does not reflect that. Which brings me to the second matter." She withdrew the next document. Set it down. Rotated it. The second matter was the one that had taken Beverly and me 4 months to build. 4 months of pulling records, locating contracts, reconstructing timelines, and getting 3 different professional opinions on the question of spousal contribution to a family business under the Ontario Family Law Act. What we had documented was this. Over the course of 17 years, I had performed work for Morrow Developments that was specific, demonstrable, and substantial. The trades management alone, during the period when Patrick had been handling the Canada project, and the Vancouver financing simultaneously, had been estimated by 2 independent quantity surveyors at a value equivalent to what the firm would have paid a senior project coordinator. The compliance infrastructure I had built, in the first 8 years, the systems that were still being used, updated but structurally unchanged, by the current operations team, had been assessed by a management consultant at a replacement cost that made Jeffrey go very still when he read the number. There was also the matter of the Gatineau development. The Gatineau project, the largest and most profitable in Morrow Development's history, had been struggling in its planning phase. Patrick had the vision. He did not have the municipal relationships or the rezoning expertise. I had spent 4 months of 2017 working the planning files. drawing on my background with the City of Ottawa, navigating the Gatineau Planning Department in both official languages, attending public consultations, preparing the community impact documentation. I had done this without compensation, without title, and without any formal acknowledgement in the project record. Beverly had found someone who remembered me from those consultations, a senior planner at the Ville de Gatineau, who had worked with me directly, and was willing to provide a written statement confirming the scope and nature of my involvement. That statement was in the folder. The Ontario Family Law Act, Beverly said, provides for equalization of net family property that accounts for contributions made to a spouse's business. The contributions in this case are documented. They are supported by third-party evidence, and they extend the calculation of my client's entitlements significantly beyond what's been presented in this room today. Jeffrey asked for a recess. Beverly gave him 25 minutes. During those 25 minutes, Renee did not say anything to Patrick. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking at the documents spread across the table in front of her. The envelope she had slid across the tables was still sitting in front of my notepad, crisp and cream-colored and entirely untouched. I did not touch it either. I am not going to walk you through every clause of the final agreement. Some of it is private by mutual arrangement, and I have no desire to change that. What I will tell you is what mattered. Patrick kept the firm. He kept his name on the letterhead and his office on Bank Street, and the professional identity he had spent 30 years constructing. He kept the car and the investment accounts he had opened after the separation. He kept the outward markers of a life built on the story he told about himself. What he could not keep was the version of that story in which I was a footnote, in which 31 years of my work was a rounding error, in which the house was his by default, because he had been the one writing the checks from the account that both of us had filled. The matrimonial home was addressed in a manner that reflected the actual legal ownership. The spousal contribution claim was settled at a number that Beverly described afterward, in her understated way, as fair, which coming from Beverly meant she was satisfied. I walked away from that room with a financial outcome that accurately represented what I had contributed, not what Patrick and Renee had decided, without asking me, that my contribution was worth. Christopher drove me home from the mediation. He hadn't been in the room. I hadn't wanted him there, hadn't wanted him to have to choose a side in a space like that, but he had been waiting in the lobby with 2 coffees, because that is who Christopher is. He didn't ask how it went immediately. He waited until we were in the car on the Queensway before he said anything. Good, he said. Good, I said. He nodded and didn't say anything else for a while, which was exactly right. Renee and I did not speak for 8 months after the mediation. When we did, it was careful and partial, and nothing like what we had been before. I don't know what she had expected. I think she had expected me to be smaller than I was. I think she had carried a version of me in her mind that she had constructed over years of watching me defer to Patrick in the room while doing the real work out of the room, and she had concluded that the deferring was the whole of me. She was wrong, but being wrong about your mother is not a simple thing to reconcile, and I have tried to give her time and room to do it on her own terms. Patrick and Simone stayed together for about a year after the settlement. I heard about it through Christopher, who kept me informed without editorializing. By the following spring, something had ended. No announcement. It simply stopped, the way things stop when the circumstances that made them possible have changed. I live in the Glebe house now, and I have earned it in a way that is documented and settled, and no longer available for reinterpretation. The garden is better than it's ever been, because I have had time for it. I have a desk by the window at the back of the house, and in the mornings the light comes in from the east, before it clears the roof of the neighbor's garage. And there are exactly 7 minutes, when it hits the walls at an angle that makes the whole room look like it's made of something warm. I consult now, part-time, with 2 small municipal planning firms and 1 nonprofit that does affordable housing development in the Ottawa Valley. I am better at this work now than I was when I left it, because 30 years of watching how decisions get made inside a family business teaches you things about institutional behavior that you cannot get from a textbook. I can read the shape of a problem faster than most people half my age. I know where the money is actually going, and where the story about where the money is going diverges. I am useful in ways that are now, finally, recognized by a paycheck with my name on it. Here is what I want to leave you with. Renee slid that envelope across the table because she had already made a decision about who I was. She had decided I was the person who stayed home. The person who managed things quietly and never asked for recognition, and therefore must not need it. She had taken 30 years of my not performing my contributions and concluded that the contributions weren't there. She had mistaken my silence for emptiness. What she hadn't considered, what people who underestimate the quiet at once almost never considers, is the work that happened before the room. The years of unglamorous, unannounced, precisely documented work that nobody photographed. The legal structures put in place on a colleague's quiet advice over lunch. The records kept not out of suspicion, but out of self-respect. The professional from Gatineau who remembered my face and was willing to say so, in writing. She saw the surface of a life and thought she understood the whole of it. Beverly Chow's smile, that small, controlled, and entirely uncharacteristic smile, when Renee said the words, "Dad's name is on the house." That was the moment the room understood that the story had not gone the way anyone at that table had expected. That the woman they had written out of the narrative had, in fact, been writing her own. The people who underestimate you are not always wrong about everything. Sometimes they're right that you're quiet. Right that you don't fill the room. Right that you've spent years letting other people take the credit without making a production of it. They're just wrong about what that means. I'd like to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely. Has anyone ever looked right past the work you were doing? The real work, the kind that holds things together, and decided you weren't worth taking seriously? And then found out otherwise? Tell me what happened. I read every comment. And if this one stayed with you, you know what to do. Subscribe to Nova Payback, a new story every single day.